Oh no, you're having a problem with your podcast? Let's take a listen, see if we can't figure out what the trouble is.
I think I'm getting the black lung, Bob.
Take a deep breath. One more. Yes, you definitely have a problem with your podcast. And if you are like most people who've launched a podcast within the last couple of years, there are a lot of good reasons for that. The good thing is, you're not the first one to have issues with your podcast, and you're not alone. Stick around because I'm about to diagnose the top 4 issues that you have with your podcast. The number 1 issue that you have with your podcast is it's not growing as fast as you'd like it to be. Believe it or not, the peak of podcasts has come and gone. Now, what I'm not saying is podcasts are dead. I'm certainly not saying it's time to abandon your podcast, or if you have plans to make one, to stop. What I'm simply saying is it is harder than ever to grow a podcast. Now, in the golden days of podcasts, people were coming on and they were looking at Spotify, they were looking at Apple Music and iTunes. They were constantly searching for brand new podcasts to pick up, to listen to focus on their drive to work, doing yard work, doing chores around the house, things like that. Now, the sad fact is, people that are into podcasts have their favorites picked out. They're already listening. They already have all their podcast time taken up. There's not a lot of new people that are constantly exploring and looking for brand new podcasts. So if you've just created your podcast in the last year, the last few months, it can be really challenging to get new listeners. Now, most people I know that are putting up podcasts, they put it up on Spotify, on Apple Music, on other iTunes channels. And the biggest issue with that is these channels don't have a real great social component where people can find and discover new podcasts. Every other social media platform, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, it looks at your listening and viewing history and it makes recommendations based on the other things that you've watched. After years and years of aggregating the data and millions of users, these platforms have a really good idea of things that you want to watch and things that you want to listen to. So if you are relying on iTunes, Apple Music, Spotify to bring in new listeners, you are already making a mistake right off the bat. These platforms are great for hosting for free. They're great for having a reliable place to store dozens and hundreds of podcasts. Not great at finding new listeners. So if that's your only avenue of finding new people for your podcast, you're going to be unhappy. The second main issue that people have with podcasts these days is a lot of them are operating in an outdated format. As social media has progressed through the last few years, there has been a very noticeable and very intentional transition from texts, photos, audios, solely to video. And you've probably noticed this yourself scrolling social media. Every single platform is making a trend more and more to video. It's getting harder and harder to post just text, just audio, and they're doing that on purpose. They really want to encourage video because video performs the best. People are most likely to watch it, most likely to share it, and most likely to engage with it over any other form of media. So if you are only recording audio with your podcast, you're missing a tremendous opportunity to make different forms of content and find new people with that content. It stuns me how many times I run into people who are making podcasts within the first couple of years and they record audio only, or even worse, they film the video, but they don't use it. What is the point? If you are not using your podcast to also record video and to also make video clips that you can put on social media where people can find you, your podcast is never going to grow with the speed that you want it to. So what am I saying? Am I saying that every podcast should be a video podcast? Yes, that's what I'm saying. Every podcast should be a video podcast. This isn't 2008 anymore. Very few people are going to find your podcast if it's listen only. People want to look, they want to see, they want a connection. And the cool thing is, if you have a video podcast on a place like YouTube and someone just wants to listen, they can still play that and they don't need to watch. However, if someone does want to sit and watch and you don't have audio, you are not going to secure those new listeners. The third main issue people have when their podcasts aren't reaching all their goals is they just straight don't have enough content. It's very common for people to do a lot of work in a podcast before the podcast happens. They get the guests, they research them, they have good questions, they have a great setup, they have the people come in and they meet with them remotely, they record it, they get the audio perfect, they finish the podcast, they post it, that's it. Spotify, Apple Music, iTunes, they're really great at hosting your podcast. They're not great at delivering new listeners. You know what is great? Social media. Hey, someone should tell people that there's an opportunity to be social on social media. Wait a minute, it's right in the name. The best way to get new people to pay attention to the content that you're making is to be social with it, to put it out into the world, to share it, to give your rabid loving fans opportunities to share it with people they know that they think would love your content. If you want to share a podcast on Spotify with your friend, is there even an option for doing that doesn't go out of the app? I don't think so. In most platforms, someone who loves your podcast could share it on their own page. For the big multi-million, multi-billion dollar companies, the number one metric that they pay huge sums of cash for is shareability. They care more about their audience sharing something on their own pages because they love it so much. If you're on Apple Music, Spotify, and iTunes, there is just not an option to do that. When you're making a podcast, you want as many people listening to it as possible. You have a good message and you gotta get it out into the world. And if you are not making long form video, short form video, clips, reels, photos, the podcast, obviously, snippets of the audio only podcast. If you're not making all these different forms of content, you are just not going to find the audience that you want to find. And they're not going to be able to find you either. Then your podcast doesn't grow. And the fourth reason why your podcast is having issues is a tale as old as time. That issue is that someone on your team, or even you yourself, is trying to put as little effort into this thing as possible. Now, I wouldn't feel too bad if this is the case. It happens. We're all very busy. We have a ton of things going on with our job. And if you are making a podcast, it's probably not your first priority. Totally get that. Totally understand that. But somebody has to be busting their behind on your podcast, or it's never going to hit the growth and bring in the sponsors and the large audience that you need to start either getting new customers or getting the kind of sponsors and support and community awareness that you were hoping for when you started this whole thing. Now, what does that mean? A lot of times a podcast is run by a single person or a small team of people. And even though these people are tremendously skilled, weirdly enough, one thing I've noticed these podcasting teams almost always lack is a professional video editor or a professional social media production team. Someone has to be passionate about this podcast. If you're not making many different forms of content about it, if you are not getting it out to the right ears, if you are not posting the thing that you made, people aren't going to hear it. It's not going to grow. You're going to be frustrated. That's it. If you are working with a social media company that told you to delay, that told you not to post, I would think really strongly why you're working with them. What are the goals? It's one thing to delay production for a month or two to build up a backlog so you never miss a post, but honestly, a good team is going to be able to take a single podcast and make many pieces of content for it in a very quick period of time. In fact, if you're working with someone who's not doing that, fire them. Go find somebody who knows how to take your podcast and turn it into long form video, short form, reels, clips, everything. If you believe in your podcast and you have a message that you want to get out to the world, you got to get it out to the world. You got to put some effort into it. And if your team is not prepared, hire an expert team like the team at Doc Social. We are experts at taking medical professionals and getting their word out to the people that need it the most, the patients. Every single day, there are millions of Americans going online for health advice, trying to find an expert like you. And if you are not available, who do they turn to? They turn to influencers, people with no medical background, no training, no experience, and no knowledge. And they listen to misinformation, they get lied to, and they're never able to connect with you, the expert that they're looking for. More than 75% of people today find their doctor online before they show up to an appointment. Make sure you're online, make sure your knowledge is there, ready to help people improve your patient's health and find new clients. Now you know what was wrong with your podcast. And if your podcast is sick, if you have one of these issues, you got to watch this video right here, because I'm going to tell you how to solve all these issues, how to get your podcast healthy, and how to get it back on track. I'll write you a prescription in the next video. If you want to learn more about how to get your medical expertise to new patients and to improve your current patient's health, make sure you follow, like, and subscribe to Doc Social. We'll be here all week. Bye, folks.